The French Revolution was the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. Sorry for being hyperbolic or biased, and apologies to the revolutionaries in the comments. I'm just saying that according to Joseph de Maistre, one of the most brilliant and terrifying political philosophers you've never heard of, he thinks the French Revolution was literally a satanic inversion of the natural order. And thus, everything wrong with the modern world like democracy, equality, and individual rights, including secular government. All of that traces back to this horrific moment when the mob stormed the Bastille and decided that they were the ones who could rebuild civilization from scratch. A quick aside, find any German and ask him what he thinks of the French Revolution. To give you a hint, a lot of the men we will talk about in this series think this same thing. So what makes de Maistre so dangerous, and why would he be relevant today? Well, after he was done preaching to the anti-France choir, he did explain exactly why this happened, and why it was doomed to fail from the start, but specifically what it revealed about human nature that Enlightenment thinkers refused to accept at the time. His analysis is looking more prophetic every single day. The man who watched the world end. Picture Joseph de Maistre. In 1789, he's watching the news from Paris with growing horror. He's an aristocrat from Savoy, a deeply religious man, and someone who believed in the old order of kings and nobles and priests. Suddenly, everything he thought was permanent and sacred is being torn down by screaming mobs who think that they can create a better world through reason and revolution. Obviously, de Maistre's mad because his side is losing. But what he's more horrified about is that he thinks he understands something that the revolutionaries don't. That civilization is incredibly fragile, and that it depends on things that they can't see or measure, or that they don't see, and that once they destroy the sacred foundations of his beloved society, they won't be able to rebuild them with their clever political theories. So he watches as revolutionaries promise liberty, equality, and fraternity. He watches as they create their perfect, rational constitutions and their scientific systems of government. And then he watches as it all collapses into terror, war, and eventually dictatorship under Napoleon. Obviously, de Maistre is not surprised, because unlike the Enlightenment thinkers of the time, who believed that human nature was good and perfectible through reason, de Maistre understood something different, that human nature is fundamentally fallen, in the Christian sense, corrupt and dangerous. When you take away traditional restraints like religion, hierarchy, custom, and authority, you're not going to get noble savages living in harmony. You will get the guillotine, the executioner as the pillar of society. Here's where de Maistre gets quite dark, and frankly honest. He writes a passage that still makes people uncomfortable today. The executioner is therefore the cornerstone of society. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment gives way to chaos, thrones topple, and societies disappear. Think about what he's saying. Every society, no matter how civilized it pretends to be, ultimately rests on violence. There has to be someone willing to use force against people who don't follow the rules. And that someone, whether it's the executioner or the police or the military, they're not just a necessary evil, they're the foundation that everything else is built upon. The revolutionaries thought that they could create a society based purely on reason and consent. But what happens when people don't consent? What happens when people don't want to follow your rational constitution? Eventually, you're going to have to force them. And the French Revolution proved this by becoming one of the bloodiest periods in human history. So de Maistre saw this coming from the beginning. He did understand that all political authority ultimately comes from God, and that when they were to remove divine authority, you get chaos followed by tyranny. The revolutionaries thought they were liberators, bringing humanity from oppression, but they were actually unleashing forces they couldn't control. The satanic revolution. De Maistre goes further again. It would be one thing to say the French Revolution was misguided or dangerous, but he thinks it was literally satanic, a demonic inversion of the proper order of reality. I'll try to explain it like this. The traditional order places God at the top, and then kings who rule with their divine right, and then nobles who serve the king, and then common people who serve their betters. In this system, everyone has their place, everyone knows their role, and the whole system is held together by sacred bonds that go back centuries. The revolution flipped this completely upside down. It puts man at the center instead of God. It makes the people sovereign instead of the king. And it declares that all authority comes from below instead of above. And what's below if not hell? It relied on human wisdom instead of divine revelation. What happened? Chaos, terror, war, and millions dead. Ultimately, the complete breakdown of everything that makes civilization possible, in de Maistre's eyes. He saw this as proof that the revolutionaries weren't only wrong, but they were doing the wrong on the devil's behalf by inverting the satanic order, the sacred order that God established for human happiness and flourishing. Now, stupid people will write this off as religious fanaticism, but they miss a sophisticated analysis of what happens when you try to base society on purely human foundations instead of transcendent ones. Remove the sacred, and doesn't everything become negotiable? Remove divine authority, and what are you left with? You get power struggles, and you get competing human wills. The impossibility of human rights. Where de Maistre gets most unpopular, and his analysis is kind of uncomfortable, is that he completely rejects the idea of universal human rights. It's not because he's cruel or because he doesn't care about human suffering, but what he proposes is that rights without duties are meaningless, and duties without divine authority cannot be maintained. So, when the revolutionaries declared that all men are born free and equal with certain inalienable rights, de Maistre asked, says who? If there's no God, if there's no divine law, if everything is just matter in motion following natural laws, then where do these rights come from? Why should anyone respect them? And what makes them any more valid than the traditional privileges of kings and nobles? He says you can't derive ought from is. You can't get moral obligations from physical facts. The only way rights can be real and binding is if they were to come from a source higher than human opinion. That source being God, who works through traditional authorities that have been tested by centuries of experience. Now, modern people will think this sounds oppressive, but de Maistre says we have it backwards. Traditional society might limit your individual freedom in some ways, but it gives you something much more valuable, which is a secure place in a meaningful cosmic order. In this order, you know who you are, what your duties are, and how you fit into the larger scheme of things. On the contrary, a revolutionary society promises unlimited freedom, but can deliver anxiety, alienation, and constant conflict. Everyone is competing with everyone else for resources and status. Nothing is sacred, nothing is permanent, and nothing gives life ultimate meaning. You're free, but free to do what? To consume? Free to pursue your own selfish desires. Is that really freedom? Or is it spiritual slavery? Providence and punishment. The most sophisticated part of de Maistre's analysis is as follows. Although it might not sound like it, he doesn't think that the revolution happened by accident. He thinks, or knows, or knew that it was part of God's full plan to punish Europe for its sins and eventually restore a proper order. The Enlightenment had been spreading for decades before 1789. People were already losing their faith. They were questioning traditional authority, and they were putting human reason above divine revelation. The revolution was just the logical conclusion of this process. And maybe, he says, God's way of showing people where this path leads. It's like a parent letting their rebellious teenager make their own mistakes. Maybe God allowed the revolutionaries to try their experiment in creating heaven on earth through human reason, and when it collapsed into terror and tyranny, that could have been his way of teaching humanity that there are no shortcuts to paradise, and most importantly, that there's no way around the need for divine authority and traditional wisdom. So this would then mean that the revolution wasn't really about politics. It was fought on a higher level, on a higher plane, a spiritual warfare. The forces of chaos and rebellion against God versus the forces of order and submission to divine will. So, eventually, de Maistre believed order would win, but only after humanity learned its lesson through suffering, the restoration that never came. De Maistre did live long enough to see Napoleon defeated and the old monarchies restored across Europe. He thought that this proved his point, that revolutionary chaos naturally leads to dictatorship, and that eventually people do get tired of instability and welcome back traditional authority. But the restoration he hoped for never really happened. These ideas from the revolution, like popular sovereignty, individual rights, and equality before the law, let alone secular government, they spread across the world and became the foundation for our modern political order. From his perspective, what this means is that we're still living in this order, still going through the consequences of the original satanic rebellion. So every breakdown of democracy or cohesion, or every loss of meaning, It's all traceable back to that moment when humanity decided it could govern itself without God. And the more unstable and chaotic our politics become, the more prophetic the Maistre looks. His prediction was that societies based on human reason would be inherently unstable, and that rights without duties would lead to social fragmentation, and that secular authority would ultimately rest on nothing but force. The modern relevance. So why does this 200-year-old reactionary matter today? Potentially because he understood something about political authority that us modernists don't. That stable government requires more than just good institutions and rational policies. It might require shared beliefs about the sacred, about ultimate meaning, and about humanity's place in a larger cosmic order. So every time you hear someone complain about the breakdown of social trust, the polarization of politics, and the loss of shared values, they're basically making a Maistrian argument. They're saying that purely secular, rational approaches to government aren't enough to hold society together. And in the same way, every time populists revel against establishments, or every time conservatives fight against secular liberalism, they're channeling de Maistre's insight that human beings do indeed need more than freedom and prosperity. They need meaning, sometimes a hierarchy, and sometimes, or all the time, sacred authority. De Maistre would look at our current political situation and say, I told you so. If not, we're cooked. You can't build a stable society based on nothing but individual rights and democratic procedures. Eventually, people do need something to believe in that's bigger than themselves. And if you don't give them God or traditional authority, they'll create their own gods. Whether that's the nation, the race, the party, the revolution, or just worship the devil. The eternal choice. What makes de Maistre really relevant to our story, and why I chose him, is that he forces us to confront a choice that most people don't want to acknowledge. Either there's a sacred order that transcends human opinion, or it's all just power struggles between competing groups with no ultimate basis for saying one's better than the other. If you believe in universal human rights, or if you think some things are objectively right and wrong, regardless of what people say, or basically if you believe that democracy has moral limits, then you're making claims that require some sort of transcendent foundation. And de Maistre would say the only foundation solid enough to support those claims is divine authority, then made to work through traditional institutions. If you don't believe in anything transcendent, and if you think everything is just human opinion and social construction, then you can't really object to tyranny or oppression except by saying, I don't like it, which isn't much of a basis for political resistance. This is the choice that our generation has to make. Divine authority and traditional hierarchy, with all their limits or minimal limits on individual freedom, or human autonomy, democratic equality, but with all the potential for chaos and nihilism. De Maistre made his choice, and he spent his whole life explaining why every attempt to escape this choice through reason and revolution is doomed to failure. The question is, which side are you on? And will you have the courage to follow your choice to its logical conclusion? Next time, we're going to see how a German philosopher took these insights about authority and hierarchy and turned them into a complete system for understanding history, politics, and human nature. Get ready for some ideas that are even more challenging to your modern sensibilities. Thank you.